Just a reminder, we have some great events coming up. On Wednesday, June 30th at 7 o'clock, we'll be talking about how the courts fit into redistricting and fair maps work here in Ohio. And then Monday, July 12th, I'll be interviewing the current president of the Ohio Association of Elections Officials and the one who just finished her term as president, and we'll be talking about election administration and voting election policy. Those are free, of course. Just a reminder that we do have Youth in Action, which is a space for young leaders to become advocates. Now is the time for us to work on fair maps. Right now we have a big fundraising campaign going on, especially to run our map competition. We've got 15,000 yard signs going across the state. We have so much work to do. Every donation, small and large, counts. Please help us. We are a membership organization, membership led. And that's been the case for 100 years. And so just a reminder that please be a member, and you make good, they also make great presents. Gift memberships are a great idea. Next slide. And I'm super excited to be with all of you today for Luncheon with the League with William Hershey, or who I call Bill. He's a journalist and author. He's got a new book out. Hopefully you can see that, Profiles and Achievements. Very excited about that. Bill has a BA in history from Albion College. I also have a BA in history. That's one of mine, Bill. He grew up in Flint, Michigan, and he has his master's in journalism from Columbia. He lives in Columbus with his wife, Marcia, who's also his technical assistant. Thank you, Marcia. He's Pulitzer Prize winner. He has reported for the Washington Bureau of the Akron Beacon Journal, also has been the State House Bureau Chief for the Akron Beacon Journal and the Dayton Daily News. He's been around for a long time. And as democracy nerds, which League members are, it's great to talk to someone who's been covering democracy for so long. And so what we're going to do is I'm going to turn it over to Bill. He's going to give us a little introduction. He and I are then going to have a little conversation. And if you have questions, you can put those in the chat. So with that, thank you so much, Bill. Welcome. We're so glad you're with us.
Well, thank you. Thank you for being here today, and thanks for your interest in profiles and achievement. I didn't really set out to write a book like this 50 years ago when I started my reporting career at the Akron Beacon Journal by covering Mogador Village Council meetings, Talmadge Board of Education meetings, and zoning disputes about group homes and residential neighborhoods. A few years ago, however, I was talking to my political scientist friend, John Green from the University of Akron, about John Glenn, George Voinovich, Lou Stokes, Joanne Davidson, Maureen O'Connor, and others who I'd come across in my career. And John and I realized that most of these people, in fact, all the ones I just named, had significant history-making careers, and I had been fortunate enough to write profiles about many of them for the old Sunday Beacon magazine and the Akron Beacon Journal. Now, there were two others we talked about who weren't officially politicians, but they had indirect relationship to politics and compelling personal stories. First, there was New York Times reporting legend Johnny Apple, who was from Akron. And then there was a builder and sportsman, John Galbraith, from Mount Sterling, south of Columbus. So 13 of the 28 profiles in the book were first Beacon magazine articles that I wrote. 3 other profiles I wrote appeared in other parts of the Beacon Journal. We wanted to make our book more comprehensive, so we added profiles by other writers at the Beacon Journal. Now, the history makers are kind of easy to identify. Lou Stokes was the first African-American from Ohio elected to the U.S. House. Maureen O'Connor is the first woman to serve as Chief Justice of the Ohio Supreme Court. John Glenn was the first Ohioan elected to 4 consecutive U.S. Senate terms. Jim Rhodes was the only person elected to 4 four-year terms as a governor, although it did take a decision from a Rhodes-friendly Ohio Supreme Court to make that happen. And Joanne Davison was the first woman Speaker of the Ohio House. Now, not everybody made it into the book because he or she was the first to do something. Many of them just accomplished significant things. Democratic Congressman John Seiberling from Akron was the prime mover behind creation of the Cuyahoga Valley National Park, which I think is one of the premier natural attractions in Ohio. And Seiberling knew how to get things done. He was a liberal, and unlike some today, he didn't really apologize for it, but he knew how to work with Republicans, particularly Ralph Regula, Republican congressman from Stark County, south of Akron. Ralph was another master of bipartisanship. He's in the book too. Seiberling retired from Congress in 1987, but he didn't have to worry about the park. Regula was still there, and he used his senior position on the Appropriations Committee to make sure the park got the funding it needed until he retired in 2009. Now, Regula, Seiberling, and others in the book shared 2 traits that set them apart from less successful office seekers. They were focused and determined. No one more than Maureen O'Connor. Starting in 1987, she ran and lost 4 times for judgeships in Summit County before she won appointment to a judgeship in 1993. She never looked back. Jim Rhodes was another Republican who wouldn't take no for an answer. He ran twice for governor before finally winning in 1962. And then there's John Glenn, everybody's hero. He may have been an international hero back in the 1970s when he started thinking about running for the US Senate. A slip in the bathtub scuttled his first effort. Howard Metzenbaum nixed his second try. Metzenbaum defeated Glenn in the 1970 Democratic Senate primary, and then Metzenbaum lost in the general election to Bob Taft. Metzenbaum still wanted to be in the Senate. Governor John Gilligan, with support from other Democrats, tried to keep Glenn out of the Senate in 1974 when Gilligan picked Metzenbaum, not Glenn, to fill a vacancy caused by Republican Bill Saxby's resignation to become President Nixon's Attorney General. Glenn didn't back down. In what may have been the nastiest Democratic primary in Ohio political history, Glenn beat Metzenbaum in 1974 and went on to beat Ralph Perk in the general election. So Glenn had 2 strikes, but on the third one, he hit a home run. Metzenbaum was no quitter either. After defeating Glenn in the 1970 primary, as I said, he lost to Bob Taft in the general election. And then he got booted out of the Senate again by Glenn in 1974. He didn't just lick his wounds. He came back to run again in 1976. This time he beat Republican Taft in the general election. Now, many of the people in our book have focus and determination, but they have another quality, resilience. Nobody has it more than Democratic Senator Sherrod Brown and Republican Governor Mike DeWine. I like to think of them as the long distance runners of Ohio politics. Republicans might have thought back in 1990 that they'd seen the last of Sherrod Brown, when another Republican, Bob Taft, if you catch Taft is a good name in Ohio, the son of the Taft who beat Metzenbaum, and then Metzenbaum beat for the Senate the second time. Well, this young Bob Taft, as he was called, denied Brown a 3rd term as Secretary of State. Brown wouldn't go away, though. He geared up to run for the US House. Republicans thought they could prevent that. They tried to draw a district that would be hard for him to run in and win. He won a House seat in 1982 and was reelected 6 times. He left the House in 2006 when he knocked Republican incumbent Mike DeWine out of the US Senate. Now, DeWine had been a political winner since the 1970s when he was Greene County prosecutor, but he'd been beaten before. He ran against Glenn in 1990, 2 for the US Senate and lost. But he didn't give up. He ran against Joel Hyatt in 1994 and won. And then again in 2006, he got beat by Sherrod Brown, and he could have simply retired to his Cedarville home, a real pleasant country place with his wife, Fran, who was probably one of the most astute and helpful political spouses I've ever met. They could have enjoyed their multitude of kids and grandkids together. Instead, DeWine ran and won for Ohio Attorney General in 2010, was reelected in 2014. He won the governorship next, and that had been a long time goal of Mike DeWine's. I know he thought about it back in 1990, but remember, he was focused and determined. He didn't give up on that dream. And I would say he's a favorite to win re-election if the Republicans don't kick him out in a primary or weaken him so much that a Democrat like Nan Whaley or John Cranley could win the general election. Now, there's another less measurable quality that most of those in the book exhibited through long political careers: integrity. Nobody was or is perfect. In some cases, their blunders were painful and even deadly. None more than Governor Rhodes' decision to send the National Guard to the Kent State campus in 1970 when 4 students were killed. But when I think about integrity, the person I think about the most is Ray Bliss, the shy Akron insurance man who was chairman of the Summit County Republican Party, then the State Republican Party in Ohio, and finally the Republican National Chairman. Now, Bliss was always ahead of his time in political techniques. He was one of the first political organizers to use public opinion polls. Back in the 1930s, he did them by hand somehow. He would have little boxes where he'd put the votes that people had taken. And then he used TV ads. He used it to get a dull but honest Republican, Mr. Republican Bob Taft elected in 1950. He would give reporters questions to ask Taft that he knew would upset him, and he'd have meet the press forecasts. And Bliss told me that Taft always did better when he got angry, so he did that. Now the academics and the political practitioners know about Bliss rebuilding the Republican Party in Ohio in 1949 after a year before Harry Truman and the Democrats had routed the Republicans. Then he had to rebuild the party again in 1959. The year before, in 1958, Republicans had gone against Bliss's advice and put a right to work ballot issue on the statewide ballot. The only Republican to survive that year was Ted Brown as Secretary of State. Then in 1965, he had to rebuild the National Party after Barry Goldwater's landslide defeat. Bliss made his way through this political thicket with a simple creed: your word is your bond. He proved that in big and small ways through 50 years. One simple example with ultimately big consequence makes a point. 40 years after Bliss's death, it's especially relevant with all this chatter about, quote, election integrity, end quote. In 1958, a young Democrat named Oliver O'Kasich was running for the Ohio Senate against 8-year Republican incumbent Fred Danner in Summit County. Early returns showed Danner winning by about 1,400 votes. O'Kasich noted, however, that something seemed to be wrong. There were more votes for him and Danner in Cuyahoga Falls than there were total votes tabulated. Something was amiss. Democrats on the County Board of Elections sort of dismissed it. If you remember how elections used to be before everything was computerized, everybody was ready to go home. They didn't want to bother with this. One person on the Board of Elections, Ray Bliss, a Republican, decided to help O'Kasich sort things out. It turned out that a tabulation error had credited Danner with 2,000 more votes in Cuyahoga Falls than he had received. O'Kasich ended up the winner. I have always given Ray Bliss a large part of the credit for looking into that matter and correcting it, O'Kasich told me years later. O'Kasich, of course, went on to become Ohio Senate president. And maybe just as important, something happened in 1983. He was in a serious automobile accident in Florida. Governor Dick Celeste sent a state plane to bring Ocasek back to the State House to cash the crucial and winning 17th vote for the 90% tax increase that Celeste said was needed to stabilize and revamp Ohio's economy. Maybe Celeste and the Democrats had Ray Bliss to thank for that vote. So I'll turn it over to you.
That's a great review. If you're just joining, I am with Bill Hershey, and he has a new book called Profiles in Achievement about various Ohio leaders. So you did a great overview that helps us understand what you call trailblazers and why you picked who you picked. You have a lot of women in the book. And obviously we care about having women leaders. We still have a gender leadership gap in Ohio. So women, you have chapters on Betty Montgomery, Joanne Davidson, Mary Taylor, Maureen O'Connor, many. Would you say that they have anything in common that's helped them really succeed? Because politics is even harder for women, and especially women of color.
I think that what I said about Maureen O'Connor applies to all of them. They were focused and determined. I think Speaker Davidson exhibits that also. I know that some of the Democrats were dismissive of her when she was going to take over get a majority in the Ohio House and become Speaker, but she did. And I think it's hard to lose in politics and then come back again. And I think it's doubly hard or harder for a woman to do it, because until recently, not many of that women had tried it. It was unusual. I forget the year, but Mary Taylor and Barbara Sykes ran for auditor, and we had an all-female race. And I think both of them were the kind of trailblazers in their own way. Now, Mary Taylor left politics after she lost the Republican primary to DeWine. I think Barbara did too. So I think that it may sound like a cliche, but they have to be more determined and focused than men to get what they want. Another example would be Jennifer Brunner. She was elected Secretary of State, did well, had her eyes on a US Senate race. The Democrats shut the door on that. They backed Lee Fisher. Jennifer became a judge, but I see that she's back, just like Maureen O'Connor. She was focused and determined. She's running for the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court now.
So how many times has someone who became kind of one of these long distance runners, if you will, or just an iconic leader, how often were they identified as a rising star early versus how often did someone who was identified as a rising star just fizzle out and not really have that long time career? Can you talk about that dynamic?
Well, let me give you an example of the fizzle. 1982 was a good year for Democrats. Rhodes had been governor for, it seemed like, forever, and they wanted to win the governorship. Dick Celeste, who was focused and determined, had lost in 1978 to Rhodes in a narrow election, but he ran for governor that year, but so did two other Democrats. Attorney General Billy Joe Brown, who was a favorite. He'd been Attorney General for a couple of terms. But there was another rising star, as you put it, from Cincinnati named Jerry Springer. And Jerry Springer was one of the most interesting people I had ever covered. When he campaigned at restaurants, he'd go in, he had a certain charisma, could talk to people. He got beat. And he, as you said, I don't know, fizzled out was the right word, but he never ran again. There was always talk, Jerry Springer is going to run for governor, Jerry Springer is going to run for the US Senate. He was making too much money on television to do that. So I'd say that was there are other examples, but I think that's an example people might be familiar with.
How about the state of journalism? What was it like to be a State House reporter when you started 50 years ago? And what's it like today?
I didn't become a State House reporter. It was only 40 years ago, so that was 1980. But it was different. We were just starting to use computers, and we'd often end up just yelling into the phone with our stories because the computers would break down. But one of the difference, leadership in the legislature was stronger then and perhaps less democratic. Vern Rife was very good at what he did, but he was autocratic. If you got out of line, you didn't get money, you didn't get a chairmanship, and there were no term limits, so he could build up seniority. I think the coming of term limits changed things quite a bit. You don't have the continuity. But now, when my last few years covering the legislature, you weren't at the State House as much. When in the 1980s, you were there most of the time. You might have been at your office, or you could send your story from the State House floor if you had the right technology. But I think there was less back and forth between reporters and legislators. I can't speak for the last 10 years because I haven't been there. But it seems almost like a prehistoric time when I was there. We didn't have manual typewriters then, but we did just have the beginning of computers.
That's it's so interesting. How do you think democracy has changed over this time frame? Obviously that's what we care the most about. Election integrity, election access, fair districting. How has democracy changed?
Well, some of these things that were supposed to improve democracy, like term limits, I don't think have done that. I think if you look at the legislature as an outsider, which I do now, we had some doozies of scandal or scandalettes back in the 1980s, but we didn't have anything like the ongoing investigation into bribery with former Speaker Householder and others. I think the gerrymandering is worse today than it ever was back in the 1980s, not because Vern Rife or the Republican who might have been in power didn't try to create districts that favored them, but the technology is so much better. If you look at the congressional districts in Ohio now, I still find it hard to believe it's almost like Ripley's Believe It or Not for the district that goes from Toledo to Cleveland. So my conclusion would be that democracy institutionally has not improved.
So, and just for those tuning in, the league was against term limits, and what our concerns about term limits seem to be playing out. But let's talk a little bit more about redistricting. Clearly, that's our priority at the league. We've worked on it for, the first time we tried to get the legislature to act on it after the apportionment board in 1967 was in the early 1970s. What is the role of organizations like the League of Women Voters when it comes to redistricting?
I think they have a crucial role, because as important as redistricting is, the people outside of the legislature and outside of politics don't want to spend a lot of time on it. They have enough trouble learning who's running for what office. And I think groups like the League of Women Voters, Common Cause, have to, I used to like to think of organizations like that as, I don't think lobbying's a dirty word, but somebody has to be pushing for good government while utilities and corporations and unions are pushing their own interests. And it's the groups like the League of Women Voters and Common Cause that really do represent the citizens when it comes to protecting democracy and fair elections. I'm just not sure when that's going to happen in Ohio, even though it's supposed to.
Okay. And what's the role of really newspaper reporting, right? Because what you get in terms of investigative reporting out of a newspaper is very different than what you get when you turn on, say, Channel 6 or CNN. Why is that important? Why are newspapers important to democracy?
Well, they have been historically, and I worry that they will not be able to going forward. If you think of a story like the Nolte Coingate scandal. Jim Drew of the Toledo Blade was out there by himself for a long time, and he invested tremendous amounts of time in that, without daily stories. I think about the scandals that hit the State House in the 80s over speaker fees, with both Speaker Rife and Senate President Aronoff getting caught. But I know the Beacon Journal reporters that dug into that took months to do it. That was because newspapers then had lots of money. Newspapers don't have lots of money now. You can see it in the thinness. Some of the nonprofits have picked up some of the load that newspapers used to carry, but I'm concerned going forward that there won't be strong daily newspapers as there had been in the past.
I'm worried about that too. How many reporters were there, State House reporters or political reporters, when you started covering the State House?
I'm just going to take a guess, 20, 25, maybe 30 with the people that dropped in from time to time from TV and radio stations.
Okay. So that's not that much different, but the newsrooms overall are a lot smaller.
There are more reporters, but I think the Gannett Bureau now covers the Beacon Journal, the Cincinnati Enquirer, the Columbus Dispatch, and a lot of smaller papers. And I personally, as a reader of the Dispatch, think they do a good job. I'm glad we've got them here in Columbus, but I have a friend a former journalist who lives near Massillon, and gets a Beacon Journal and the Canton Repository, and there isn't that much State House coverage in either of those papers because the papers are too thin.
Right. There's not an ABJ reporter anymore. I think the last one was probably Dennis Willard.
Dennis, yeah.
Let's talk about being nonpartisan. So sometimes often the league gets, if someone doesn't like what we're doing, they'll say, oh, they're acting too Republican, or, oh, they're acting too Democrat. I see that happening with reporters too. So can you talk about what it means to be nonpartisan in hypercritical, hyperpartisan environments?
As a reporter,
Mm-hmm.
I think one thing you have to do is basic. Cosmetics do make a difference. When I was a reporter, I made it a point to not vote in partisan primaries. I think I might have in Akron once when I was covering City Hall because there weren't any Republicans. But I found out that when I did, some Republicans said to me, see, I told you, we knew you were a Democrat. And I've had Democrats accuse me of, I'm from Flint, Michigan, so I should stick up for labor unions all the time, be for Democrats. You have to try to be at least superficially above the fray and take a few brickbats. It's probably a compliment if someone says they don't know what party he or the reporter belongs to. Now I've known some journalists who won't vote, period, in elections because of that. I always thought I had the right to vote and always tried to.
Got it. Yeah, I think the cosmetics or optics, those are hard. Those are hard to manage.
Yeah.
I think for league members too, because we love democracy. That's why we do what we do. But that nonpartisan stance just matters so much. We have a question about why didn't you include Dennis Kucinich?
I thought about that, and there's practical reasons because I never wrote a Beacon magazine article about Dennis. The best story I wrote about Dennis, and I liked it, was for the Dayton Daily News when he ran for president. And it was I enjoyed the story. I was down in Kentucky. But anyway, I didn't have a story about Dennis Kucinich that we could use. There were others who, if I could just add a little bit to that, one of the people I would have liked to include it in the book was C.J. McClin of Dayton, who was the first president of the Black elected Democrats of Ohio. I think it's now the Ohio Legislative Black Caucus. And he was maybe the best vote counter I'd ever come across. Just a story, if I could, when the Black elected Democrats of Ohio was being organized, Carl and Lou Stokes from Cleveland wanted Eddie Davis, the city councilman in Akron, to run for president of Beto. And Eddie told me that he agreed to, but he got walloped by C.J. McClin, because C.J. McClin had enlisted every black city councilman, village councilman across Ohio to support him. And that's what happened. There were others that we could have included in the book: Senator Portman, Governor Kasich, and most of the time it was because we didn't have stories that would do the job we thought it should have done.
How about Joyce Beatty?
Joyce Beatty, I was looking and watching her on television the other day. She's really coming into her own. But when I stopped reporting, she was just beginning her career in the U.S. House, and she'd been in the minority in the Democratic caucus in the State House, and she was articulate and focused, but there were so few Democrats that it really didn't make too much difference what she or other Democrats did.
So you talk about Ray C. Bliss, and in your book is, comes out of the University of Akron. We work with the Bliss Institute and the Ohio Supreme Court on something called judicial votes count. But I think if you're not really in democracy, you don't know that name. And I know you talked about him a little bit, but if there was one thing that you would want people to know about Ray C. Bliss and to learn from him, what would it be?
I think it would I'm repeating myself, integrity. Your word is your bond. And it's not that Ray Bliss didn't have skirmishes. One of the great ironies of some of his career was it started after he got kicked out of the University of Akron when he was accused of stuffing the ballot box in a May Queen election. And he's never really explained what happened. And part of that is he was taking the fall for it because he was the leader of this May Queen scandal. And shortly after he became Republican national chairman, there were some holdovers from the previous administration as the Republican Party, and some of them didn't like Bliss. They were still supporting Barry Goldwater. They wanted him to make a comeback. But one of Bliss's top assistants, one of his friends, rifled the desk of this guy who was still supporting Goldwater. And Bliss had to eat crow. Lyndon Johnson, Hubert Humphrey, they all made fun of him. He was a laughing stock of Washington, D.C. because of this desk rifling incident. But he persevered. He took the blow, took the responsibility for it. And the buck stops here is a cliche, but with him, that was usually the case. And I guess the other thing about him was getting deposed by Nixon after he rebuilt the Republican Party in 1965. He wouldn't go away, and he had support from people all over the country, but Bliss came to grips with it. He said, when there was a mayor, I could do what I wanted. I could make him or her do the things I thought were necessary. And with Rhodes, they were always back and forth, the governor and the state chairman vying to be the primo Republican in Ohio. But the president, he had ultimate authority. And Bliss said, when the president is from your party, the national chairman is really just an errand boy or girl.
That's funny. I'm sorry, I was on mute because my dog, for some reason, must also be a fan of Ray C. Bliss because he just really started barking. So I apologize for that. How would you get a good scoop? How would you define a good scoop, and where would you get your information for some of your best stories?
One of my favorite stories concerns the vote that I told you about in 1983 with Oliver Kasich voting for the 90% tax increase. I had become the Beacon Journal's State House bureau chief in 1982, and that was a nightmare. The Beacon Journal was an afternoon paper. I was by myself. The Cleveland Plain Dealer had 4 or 5 reporters, and my usual 7 a.m. wake-up call at home in Bexley was, Bill, the plain dealer had this, the plain dealer had that. Where's your story? So I would scuttle down to the office and try to find something to get in the afternoon edition. Well, we told Governor Celeste and his aides that we didn't like that very much. So fast forward ahead, the Beacon Journal sent me to Florida to talk to Senator O'Casey to see what he was thinking. I got back to Ohio, and then Governor Celeste and one of his aides, they got a hold of both me and Brian Usher, who was the Columbus bureau chief, and they told us that they were sending a state plane to Florida to bring Senator O'Casey back. Didn't tell anybody else. So we had a reporter and a photographer at the airport in Akron or Cleveland, wherever it was. We had this very dramatic picture of Senator O'Casey getting off the plane, and that just was all over our Sunday paper. O'Casey comes back to Ohio, and the plain dealer in those days could be pretty haughty, and they were indignant, and they wrote a letter to the AP and said, why didn't we know about this? You knew all about this. And the editor of the Beacon Journal wrote a letter to the editor of the plain dealer and said, we know it's always hard to not get the scoop, and I know you're sorry that our one-man Columbus bureau had the story when your bureau did not. So that doesn't matter to anybody but the reporters, but I took a great deal of satisfaction in that.
Yeah, so can you just talk about that, like the relationships between reporters? Because on one hand, your lives and your careers are so similar, but on the other, you're trying to beat each other to the punch for stories. So talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, it was certainly that way in the State House in the 1980s. And you have to think about what the newspaper business was like then. The plain dealer was a statewide powerhouse. They had news boxes all over the state, and any politician who didn't try to get his or her story in the plain dealer was short-sighted. And for Republicans, the Columbus Dispatch was that way. The Dispatch today is it became a very strong and professional paper, but in those days and before, the cliche was that the press release would roll out of Emma Stoltz's typewriter. She was Governor Rhodes' secretary. Somebody would carry it across the street to the old Dispatch building, and then it would be in the Dispatch that afternoon. But the rest of us who didn't have a in like that, we had to scrap. And some reporters did, and they made their way and they got the stories first.
What's the relationship between lobbyists and reporters like?
I'm not sure you can make a blanket statement about it. The lobbyists, if they think that the story can help their corporation or their union or their cultural issue, abortion, anti-abortion, they're going to be very friendly to you and help you. But I think lobbyists also have a truth meter, and they know if a reporter says, I'm not going to do this or I'm not going to do that, and he or she doesn't do what they said they were going to, the lobbyist is going to be a little bit careful about talking to you, just like the politicians are.
And I like that term, truth meter. I think reporters also have truth meters.
Yeah, I think you better have. And that, that's the dilemma of the so-called he said, she said reporting. If you know one side is patently untrue, do you report that? And that was always a problem for me. I would try to get both sides of the story, or all the sides of the story, and never was sure if I was doing the right thing.
So I like this concept of long distance runners as you talk about politicians. I'd like to think that the League of Women Voters is a long distance runner of an organization. And I'm wondering if you could give us an example of a time that you thought League was particularly effective that we should be thinking about now and learning from now.
I think my experience would have to be with ballot education, or like for judgeships, and trying to make sure people know, at least offering the information. You can't be sure people would take it. And I think the league has also uh, been out in front with trying to make redistricting more fair, no cracking and packing. And if I would have been the league or the Common Cause, I would have quit butting my head up against the wall, because you tried and tried and tried and tried, but you did finally succeed. And it is a long distance race. Good government is a long distance race. And as an outsider now for the business, it seems like it's even more difficult than it was when I was still reporting.
Thank you for that. It is. I think that we are nothing if we are not tenacious. We don't give up. I've really enjoyed having this conversation with you. We're about done. I'm wondering if you have any kind of last thoughts. How about this? If there's a young person out there who's thinking about running for office, what advice would you? So I'm going to ask you two questions. A young person who wants to be a reporter, advice for that person. A young person who wants to run for office, advice for that person.
For a reporter, I think there are more opportunities than there ever have been in some ways, because of the online opportunities that you have. But you have to, I used to say that my last years of going to work, I felt like an electronics store. I'd have a cell phone, a tape recorder, but now you have to have a cell phone, tape recorder, and you can take video with your cell phone, but you're better off if you have a camera of some kind, this backpack journalism. So you better educate yourself across not just writing things, but recording things, filming things. I don't feel qualified to tell someone how to run for office, other than I would say that focus and determination are still important. You may lose, and if you really want, you're going to try again and learn from your defeat. You shouldn't let one defeat probably shut you down.
Thank you. It's been really fun. The time goes fast when you're having fun, Bill.
Okay.
It's a great conversation. Any last thoughts for us?
No, I thank you for having me. Hope if you get a chance, you find the book interesting. I think that some of the people in there have stories that are worth reading about and may surprise you in some ways.
So once again, this is the book, Profiles in Achievement.
And I see Michael, you can order the University of Akron Press and get a 30% discount. So that's should be a selling point.
Yeah, that helps. We put that in the chat so people know that they can do that. I hope that we'll spend more time. Also, I just want to thank you. Sometimes Catherine and I will call you and ask you questions or pick your brain about money in politics or transparency. And I just want to thank you for always being willing to have those conversations with us.
Well, I thank you. I miss having some of those conversations.
Well, let's do it more often.
Hey.
Thank you so much. And I think we have a few slides really quickly.
Okay.
So just a reminder that we have some events coming up. So here's the book, and we would love to have you get that book. Next, please join us for some upcoming events. We've got one Wednesday evening about redistricting in the courts. And then again, I will be talking to the past and present presidents of the Ohio Association of Elections Officials about elections and elections policy and voter access. If you have a young person in your life, 13 to 25, please think about having them join Youth in Action. Keep going. We are absolutely determined and we will never give up, but we also do need finances to do our campaign. So please consider donating to Fair Districts Ohio. Just to donating to Fair Districts Ohio. We've got a once in a decade opportunity to actually get fair maps and to see the reforms passed by voters in 2015 and 2018, to see those upheld, and very exciting time for us here at League. Please make sure to be a member. If you're not, members are the lifeblood of our organization. It's important when we go to talk to lawmakers or go into court to say that we have so many members. And with that, I just want to thank you. I want to thank Michael Barron, whose vision it is to do this, Cynthia Peoples, two incredible volunteers, as well as the league staff and league members, and especially you, Bill. We hope that you have a wonderful week.